Hi everyone, welcome to this video for ANU on how to pro and how to case feed in the Easters format. My name's Tom. I'm going to run through a couple of things about what is case feeding, how do we do it, why do we do it, and a few tips on how to work well with your team during preparation. A few caveats to start. I've been out of debating for a couple of years, so if things have moved on or I say something you disagree with, there's probably a good reason for it. It's probably my old-fashioned dinosaur views. Let's start with what a case feed is and why we do it. The case feed is you as the pro spending a significant amount of preparation time uh, dictating, explaining, helping your first speaker come up with the full case, nice and detailed, and that's your primary view and goal for preparation time. And the reason why we do this, especially in the Easters format, is the asymmetry in the experience of the speakers, but also just the importance, especially again in this format of making sure that your first speaker is able to deliver a clear case. You're able to do things like setup and contextualization correctly. And my experience is that the teams and the pros who could get that case out as clearly as possible at first set themselves not only up for debates they were more likely to win, but even if they were to lose debates, debates that were much cleaner, much higher quality, and hence their speaks were better as well. So I think it's a really important part of the format, and it's a very unique part of the format. In Australs or in BP when you've got less time, this is something you get to do far less. You get to do less intensely, and you get to spend less of your preparation time on. So it's a skill that's fairly unique to Easter. So, first thing I'm going to talk about is just how much time should we be spending on the feed. And I would suggest it is your primary goal during preparation is to get that case right for your first speaker, first negative or first affirmative, doesn't matter which. I would suggest you give yourself at most 5 minutes to come up with the case itself. And it does not need to be particularly detailed in your head. You'll have to fill it in as you go. I would suggest your goal, if you're trying to be competitive, is to reduce that even further to closer to 2 to 3 minutes. And that will mean that your novices will have less time to come up with thoughts. But as the pro, you're probably coming up with the majority of the case structure and case ideas anyway. So it's really about being able to spend as much time as possible explaining things and making sure they understand what they need to say in their speech. Um, so I would suggest that is something you will need to practice, the ability both to come up with a case clearly, quickly, and well structured, and then your ability to fill in the smaller details of that case during the case feed when you're explaining it to someone. They will almost certainly ask you to pause or slow down at certain times. And that is time where you can do some of the thinking to fill in some of the gaps you might not have initially thought of. So I think that I've actually jumped ahead to my next planned point, which is kind of tips for coming up with that case nice and quickly. The final thing I would note here is that you absolutely still need to listen to your teammates, even if your novice is, attending one of their first university debating tournaments and maybe didn't debate in high school. They're still going to come up with some good case ideas, and you should listen to them, even if you're much more experienced. And even if their ideas are not as good or they're not as well thought out as yours, but they're at least in the ballpark, I would really suggest part of good proing is making sure that person feels heard. They have confidence in the things, the arguments they come up with, and the ones you give them. And that would mean I would suggest doing things like saying, "Oh, I think that is a good idea. I think it fits within this idea I had," or I agree. I think we're basically thinking about the same thing. I just think this heading's better. But it's the same idea. Things like that to help link the thoughts that people already have that they're confident about to the ones you're giving them will make this process a little easier as well. So let's think and talk then about the kind of meat and potatoes of this. How do you explain a case to a novice, to a first speaker? I think there's a couple of things that are really useful. The first is about having clear structure and headings. So being able to tell them we have three arguments that you need, say, a page for context or modeling. That's having really clear delineations around, well, here's our context, here's our mechanism, here's our impact, or however you like to structure an argument. And figuring out in, however much practice you get in the lead up to Easter's, how that process works between you as the pro and the novice. So is that things like, do they like using different colored pens? Do you need to leave gaps to allow you to come back and add additional mechanisms. That's something personally I found really important because I often came up with another mechanism 2 minutes later and gone, oh, that's a really good, we need to put that in there. And to not confuse my novice, I needed to be able to explain quite clearly where that fit in the structure. But good structure is just very helpful to understand what's going on. And it goes to that goal of trying to set up the debate as cleanly as possible and clearly. Not everything's going to be fully explained, but if at least your structure is nice and clear, that will help judges and the opposition understand your case. And that's, of course, useful for your ability to go back and whip that material. So I would suggest, yeah, very clear structure on how your argumentation and your case fits together. I think things like telling speakers that this is a new argument, so we need a new page, is often something that people aren't actually used to if they're not particularly experienced debaters, and that really helps kind of make the way they deliver their speech clearer. And it's something you can do in the prep room. You can say, okay, have you got that written down now? Yep, you understand that. Any questions? Nope. Cool. New argument, new piece of paper. Oh, there's some white space. Don't worry. Like that's the sort of thing that can genuinely be very reassuring, but seems very obvious to someone who's done debating for quite a while. I would also just suggest the activity of a case feed is about building trust. So it is about knowing that the ideas that you're giving someone are sensible and they should trust you even if they don't fully understand something. It's about kind of building up enough trust within that relationship to allow them to say, actually, can we slow down a little bit? Or I don't understand this particular argument. Or, you know, to be honest, I'm going to say the headings for you, but I don't understand this, so I'm not going to be able to deliver it properly. Those are all things that giving your novice some trust and believing that they will be able to deliver the material you give them, but also, making the team environment comfortable, something that's really important. And I would suggest this is one of your focuses in the lead up to the tournament, things you should be preparing and working on and making sure people are comfortable. Part of building trust is also what happens after they've delivered the speech. So telling them they did a good job, whipping parts of the material, like, as my first speaker, I'm going to use James because he used to be a novice of mine. As James said, and you guys ignored X, Y, Z. Those are parts of the process and the relation building that I think is very important in feeding a case. I think the final thing is sometimes there will just be instances in which someone doesn't understand an argument, but it's or a piece of material or a model or a particular example or whatever it is. That's going to happen sometimes. Sometimes you're going to have to tell someone, I just need you to say that. And that might mean you have to dictate that material to them. It might mean you need to tell them to underline it, whatever works for you guys. But that's occasionally going to have to happen, especially on things like modeling in first speaker speeches. So make sure that you build up some system to make sure that is always captured, and that sometimes your novice expects that they don't understand it, but they've got to say it anyway. All right. This has then focused a lot on how is your relationship working delivering the case to the first speaker. I think it's equally important during the case feed to have a bit of an understanding of what you're going to be doing with your other speaker. They're not writing down the whole case. They shouldn't be using the same amount of paper as you, but they should still be paying enough attention to you, regardless of what they might otherwise be doing, to have, I would suggest, a single piece of paper that is kind of their source of truth on what arguments you've run. So the main headings, a couple of the mechs, maybe an impact or two. One page has kind of worked for me and other novices. So I'd suggest that is something that they should be paying enough attention to you. And their main goal is to understand that. And then it's to do secondary things like make sure that, maybe they're preempting some rebuttal or they're coming up with another argument or whatever other uses you might come up with, you and your second novice, to use that time particularly well. One of the other things I would suggest about the feed itself is that you should probably give your novice an introduction, and in most cases, you should probably script that for them. Now, sometimes novices will be good at that, so you can leave it to them. Sometimes it's just fine to say, you know what, I haven't got one. Just do the whole, you know, I have three arguments in my speech. They are X, Y, Z, whatever it is. But this is a big part of making the case make sense to your novice and make them feel confident. If they can start that speech off on a good note, that often flows through into the way they deliver the rest of the content. So I would suggest that is also something that can be an important part of the case feed. And that might be something you draft very early on, but I'd suggest it's probably something you draft towards the end because as nice as it is, getting down the core arguments is probably a more important part of that working relationship. So there's a few tips and tricks on how to build that relationship and how to feed a case to a novice. Obviously your novices will have varying amounts of experience, and you will build that relationship in different ways. But I would suggest it's one of the most important parts of the Easters format. For those inclined to practice, to try and practice these skills outside of debates themselves or perhaps scrims in the lead up to the tournament, I'd suggest it's usually enough to do a practice prep and a single 1A with that speaker. If your other novices involved, I would suggest they come up with kind of the rebuttal they would provide, at 1N, even if they're speaking, straight second or third or whatever it is. There's like a minute or two of rebuttal to get them involved. But really, you can shorten that up. You can do that outside of a full debate to practice that skill, to get comfortable. And I would suggest, you make sure that that novice is comfortable voicing what is useful for them. So things like, you're going too fast, or I don't find these arguments particularly easy to get my head around, or you know what, I just don't know anything about IR, so you're going to have to, kind of like spell out the countries and examples for me more than you might a mechanism. All those things are part of developing the working relationship. It's a really important part of Easters. It's a really important part of making sure that debates go well, people enjoy their debates. And I would suggest that this can also be an intense part of the activity in the tournament. And to always keep in mind that, this is a young person who's just approaching this activity. And first and foremost, they want to have fun. And giving them a good case and making them feel confident is part of that. But also, uh, making them feel uncomfortable or, maybe just more stressed than they need to isn't good for either competitive or enjoyment goals. So it's something people should be really mindful when they feed a case. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful. A few tips and tricks on how to do this part of debating and proing at Easters. Good luck for everyone for the tournament, and enjoying the activity.